one of my side interests is to look at the archaeological artifacts in Hong Kong. And surprisingly, in spite of the small aerial size, just about 1,000 square kilometers of Hong Kong, we actually have a very rich archaeological history. And around Hong Kong, we have a number of rock carvings, and one of them was just recently discovered. And the history of inhabitants in Hong Kong actually dates all the way back to the Neolithic age, about 6,000 years ago. And these are some of the archaeological rock or stone carving sites around Hong Kong. And if we look at the archaeological sites, we actually have over 200 of them. And so for a while, Hong Kong, this area about 6,000 years ago, had actually quite a population. And most of the inhabitants were distributed along the coast. And each red dot here represents one of our archaeological sites. And of these sites, a lot of archaeological artifacts were unearthed, and they bear similar characteristics as many of those that were discovered in central China, dated back all the way to about 6,000 years ago. And so these are just among some of the collections. And even as recent as 3 years back, when they tried to construct a new primary school in western part of Hong Kong, and while they were doing the site formation, they unearthed a very extensive archaeological sites, and there were all sorts of findings, and they also discovered 36 graves, and they don't have carvings, just the bones. There's still skeletons there, and then this is actually the skull of a person, and near the feet there were two pot vases, and then the body was sort of resting on top of a ceramic tile. And I don't actually do archaeology. I'm not an archaeologist. But anytime they find archaeological sites, and sometimes they engage me to look at the stone artifacts. What government wants to know is whether these stone artifacts came from nearby area or whether they actually were derived from a long distance. So based on that, we hopefully try to reconstruct the trade and communication network. And so I was somehow accidentally involved in these sort of study projects. We also did dating. For example, this very site here, and we look at the sand layers where the artifacts were buried, and we took the samples to OSL dating, based on which we can determine the age of the site. And for example, at this particular site, we unearthed samples from various levels and determined that they were just about between 5,000 to 6,000 years old. And so that dates back to what we call the Neolithic age. It's very interesting because for the whole China, or especially South China, there was a very rich culture and population in this general area just about 5,000 years ago. And then, just like the Mayans, and suddenly it disappeared. And then there was another gap, a long gap, where we had a little background history or information. And then later, civilization reemerged in this area. So, like in this particular project, they paused the construction and they engaged me, and I also took along my students, and we did some mapping on the site. So meticulously, we tried to identify the material of the stone and jade artifacts on site without moving them to a lab. And then, unfortunately, after we were done with our work, then they have to resume the construction, and then they took out the the artifacts. They took out the skull, the skeleton, the bodies, and then they resumed the reconstruction. Otherwise, this is one of the probably most valuable educational sites, for archaeology, for showcasing to students. And a lot of materials were unearthed, and just at this particular site, there were about 6,000 pieces of artifacts, and about half of them were either stone or jade artifacts. And so we look at each individual artifact one at a time, try to use some simple tests to determine, whether what kind of rocks they are, whether they were, similar exposures in Hong Kong. I'm a geologist by training, and I'm probably the person, at least one of the person most knowledgeable of the local geology. So I know almost every piece of rock that could be found in Hong Kong. And so by looking at these archaeological artifacts, we try to see if there were similar exposures in Hong Kong. For example, this particular one, like this is a Chalcedony and a pink one, and this has to be from outside. There were marble, like limestone and marbles. We do not have marble exposures in Hong Kong. We have marble, but they were located about 5 or 6 meters underground. There's no surface exposure of marbles or limestone. So based on which we know that they have to come from outside this general area. And then there are other rocks like basalt and volcanics, etc., that we look at meticulously. And the archaeology community tends to just divide very crudely the stone artifacts into 2 types. One they call the stone artifacts. The other they call jade artifacts. Jade artifacts are a lot of the decoration, what they used to as a jewelers in the old days, are generally just called jade. So my interest is whether they are really jade or not. We know that there is no nephrite, if we use the more technical term, in this part of China. So exactly what kind of materials are those jade artifacts? So this is one of my interests. So we look at, for example, at this particular site, and meticulously we try to identify the rock materials that made up every single piece. Majority of them are rocks, of various kind. We find igneous rocks, volcanic rocks, and also metamorphic rocks. So we categorize them, and these are the pitch number for every square of the site. We try to identify how many pieces of artifacts were unearthed and what sort of material were they made of. And so we tally up the total and then try to look at the distribution of the material. And, there were a lot of surprises, when we look at those bangles and those earrings and nose rings that they made. They were very, very well and precisely produced. And so even dating back to about 6,000 years ago, the people already mastered a lot of these techniques and skills in producing these artifacts. And these are some of the artifacts that they call jade, like this piece here, or this piece, they were either used as nose rings or as earrings or as bangles, etc. And these are used as sort of necklaces. They are, there's a whole inside is like a tube, so they use them to produce necklaces. So we look at them, and then we look at materials that made them up, the hardness, the density, and occasionally we were able to take 1 or 2 pieces to the lab to do some geochemical analysis. We use ICBMS, etc., to look at the trace element, and I, just to cut it short, basically when we look at these what they call jade artifacts. We have studied over, several hundred pieces of them. They were not nephrite. Okay, none of them was nephrite, and we know that nephrite is a magnesium aluminum silicate, and is very popular and common in China, especially in central and northern part of China. And when we look at the composition, and then often they were replacement of serpentinite or dolomites, etc. A characteristic of nephrite is the presence of magnesium in the mineral composition. But for the kind of materials that we found in the Hong Kong area, and they lack this magnesium in the elemental composition, and majority of them belong to a category of stone, what we call is a hydrous aluminum silicate, basically some kind of hydrothermal alteration of micaceous material. And like they are soft, typically with a hardness between 2 to 2.5, and density is about 2.4, etc. And then we look at them, and then what we found is that many of these decorative rings and tubes are made of a material not readily available in Hong Kong area. They are some kind of hydrous aluminum silicates, and what they resembled is the material that we typically use in making ink stamps in China. And they are a kind of mineral, what we call algametolite or pagodite in simple Chinese term. In Chinese, 手山石 is a very commonly used material for making inkstone stamps. They are not found extensively in this part of South China, but they were found a lot in the Fujian area, Fujian area, to the east about 600-700 kilometers away. And so based on the material distribution, and then we were able to construct, for example, the extent of the trade or communication network way back to about 6,000 years ago. And for example, this area where I shade it a little bit is an area that produced a lot of those algametolite, the 手山石. And so we believe that back then a lot of those jade and decorative materials were made in this general area, and then somehow traded to Hong Kong area through a lot of the river routes, etc. So this is still preliminary, and then we're still trying to do a more extensive study and trying to enrich our understanding of the this part of history dating back to about 6,000 years ago. And with that, I thank you for bearing with me through this talk, and thank you.